Welcome to the 2013-14 season of Primetime with BU Library Investigators and Directed History Department. Primetime celebrates learning beyond the classroom through the experiences and accomplishments of local faculty like Phyllis, Alsdurf, students and staff. This collaborative project between friends of the BU Library, faculty development, many other offices on campus. If you'd like to see what's coming up on Primetime, check out the homepage of the library website, where upcoming events are listed. And if you missed one, most are recorded, thanks to Bob over there, and it can be viewed online in the BU Digital Library. Coming up on Thursday, a week from today, November 14th, Drs. Carrie Depley, Chris Armstrong, and Mark Bruce present Why Would a Protestant Evangelical Care About Medieval Christianity? I'm not sure anyone cares a great deal about medieval Christianity. Today's presentation is one in a series, I think 8 total, previewing chapters from a forthcoming book I'm editing called Whole and Holy Persons, a Pietist Approach to Christian Higher Education. The next one will be December 3rd. Samuel Zelenga from Anthropology Sociology will present Pietism and the Transformation of Individuals and Societies. And then on December 12th, a former colleague of ours, David Williams, a philosopher at Azusa Pacific, will be back on campus to present his approach to scholarship and teaching. But today we welcome Phyllis Alsdurf from the English Department, director of the Journalism Program, as she presents The Quest for an Evangelical University, Carl F. H. Henry and Carl H. Lundquist. And she certainly knows Carl Henry very well, having written her dissertation on the history of Christianity today. She'll present 2 views of Christian higher education based on the chapter she's writing for our Home and Holy Persons book. So, Phyllis, welcome.
Thank you. Well, I hope this can be kind of an informal conversation as I go along. Chris mentioned that I did my dissertation work on Carl Henry. Carl Lundquist and Carl Henry have their first names in common, and they both are people of significance within evangelicalism, but in some respects, Carl Henry's cast a much longer shadow than Carl Lundquist. And part of my feeling after having done some of this research is that Carl Lundquist deserves a little more press than he's gotten, and I'll talk about some of the reasons I feel that way. The first emphasis, I'll start with Henry and then move to Lundquist and talk a little bit about how I see their 2 philosophies of education differing and the implications of that for Christian higher education and Bethel in particular. Carl Henry was a journalist and theologian. He's considered, by many people, probably the most significant theologian, evangelical theologian in the last half of the 20th century. He died in 2003 at the age of 90. He devoted himself to making evangelicalism intellectually respectable, and he put such an emphasis on the intellectual development, and that was his kind of signature as a theologian. He held 2 PhDs, one in theology from Northern Baptist Theological Seminary, where Carl Lundquist also received his PhD, and then he got a PhD in philosophy from Boston University. Henry first came on the scene, his prominence was first acknowledged, I think, in about 1947, when he published his first book, The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism. And in this book, it's hard, I was trying to think of something parallel today. Like, what's a popular Christian book? The Prayer of Japan. No, let's see. Although if you read The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism, even though Henry's a good communicator, it's not like light reading in that sense. But he was really taking to task largely the perspective of fundamentalists, or at that point evangelicalism wasn't really clearly identified, so it was all under this umbrella of fundamentalism. And he took fundamentalism to task for its separatism and its pulling back from culture rather than engaging culture. He called it his manifesto, and it really rocked the evangelical world. It signaled a new commitment to social engagement for conservative Christians. He called for denominational unity. This is about the time that the National Association of Evangelicals was founded, and it was founded kind of in reaction to another organization of conservative denominations called the American Association of, I'm forgetting the whole name, American Association of not Christian churches or something, but it was a much more conservative group headed by Carl McIntyre. And it was known for its separatist mentality, pulling away from the culture. The culture was evil and it was to be pulled away from. Henry, on the other hand, wanted people to be engaged and socially informed, to challenge the culture rather than to withdraw from it. In 1956, he became the first editor of Christianity Today magazine, and that came after he was served as a theology professor at Fuller Seminary. He left Fuller to help found Christianity Today, which really was a publication that emerged out of a vision that Billy Graham had. And Carl Henry became kind of it was, said that Billy Graham was the heart of evangelicalism and Carl Henry was the mind of evangelicalism. He used CT as, kind of his stump for promoting evangelicalism and for articulating what it meant to be an evangelical. He had journalistic training before he became a Christian. He had worked for the New York Herald Tribune and also as a stringer for the New York Times out in Long Island. He became a Christian, was converted in his early 20s, late teens, and heard about Wheaton College, moved to Chicago area, and he also wrote for the Chicago Tribune there. He went to Wheaton, and then he went to Northern, as I said, and then to Boston University. Taught at Gordon for a while, then went to Fuller when it was founded. In the early, mid-40s, there were a lot of things happening. The NAE was formed, Fuller Seminary, lots of different, Youth for Christ was just taking off. Billy Graham was becoming much better known. And Henry became the kind of the intellectual spokesperson for evangelicalism. He called for a sophisticated and irenic theological conservatism. Notice the word irenic. Let's see, I'm going to see if I can use this little pointer thing. There, irenic. When I defended my dissertation, one of the people on the group of people I was presenting to said, they asked me about irenicism. And it's one of those words when you type it in, the word always puts it in red because it's like, this is not spelled right or something. It's not a common word, but irenicism really was the kind of thematic of Billy Graham's approach, and he wanted a publication that was not kind of parochial and separatist, but something that was aimed toward unity, that was intellectually sound, but the goal was to bring people together, not to move them apart. During his career, Henry wrote 38 books, including the 6-volume God, Revelation, and Authority, which is seen as just really kind of the kind of seminal work of evangelical theology. And he was really prolific as an editor. It was kind of fun to analyze his journalistic style. He thought nothing of having 15-page editorials in a magazine. And then when people said, like Nelson Bell, his managing editor, Billy Graham's father-in-law, questioned whether or not people wanted to read all that, it was like, well, of course they wanted to read it, a 12-page series on eschatology, a 41-essay series on basic Christian doctrines, a 13-booklet series on fundamentals of the faith. Greta, you need to get busy on the Clarion. You've got a lot to do this year. We don't tend to think today of editors as being the ones who do the bulk of the writing in a magazine. Henry did. He wrote long articles. He covered events internationally. He traveled throughout the world covering missions or events, Billy Graham crusades, Lausanne conferences. He became the spokesman worldwide for evangelicalism. He also was engaged at East Coast colleges. There are some famous anecdotes about him at Brown University, and he was at Union Theological Seminary where he engaged Karl Barth in some banter. We got into a similar kind of thing with Niebuhr, and so he wanted to bring evangelicals to the forefront as people who were not just kind of buffoons out in the sticks, but people who were well educated and aware, and they had the right answers, and he believed that. He made neo-evangelicalism intellectually respectable. So if you don't suffer, some of you students, if you don't suffer from a great deal of social stigma, you can thank someone like Carl Henry. Because, when I was your age, there was still a lot of stigma around being a conservative Christian, being an evangelical. It was seen as sort of kind of backwoodsy, and you weren't quite with it. I don't know if Carl Henry would want to take credit for what's going on in the church today, but he had something to do with it. CT's purpose was to win a hearing for evangelical orthodoxy from non-evangelical scholars. So even in the way the magazine was formulated, he was often engaging non-evangelicals to write for the magazine, including people, who we might not necessarily think of. I'm trying to think of some examples of people they tried to get, which are kind of, J. Edgar Hoover wrote a couple pieces. And then, he tried to get Niebuhr to write, and Lewis, different people. Cultural acceptance through rigorous intellectual demonstration of correct ideas was foundational to his way of thinking. So I'll just quickly run through this. He was considered the architect of evangelicalism because at that point evangelicalism was being defined vis-a-vis fundamentalism. It was pulling away, and it was called neo-evangelicalism when he started. He counseled top evangelical leaders, established the Institute for Advanced Christian Studies, which was right along here. Gets into his educational philosophy a little bit. He moderated a TV series, delivered hundreds of lectures, and then he developed this comprehensive vision for cultural engagement for evangelicals. But one of his signature visions and dreams, probably the one that was closest to his heart, was to see an evangelical Harvard established. That's what he wanted more than anything. He wanted it to be evangelistic in relevance, evangelical in doctrine, to hold to the highest academic standards, committed to moral purity, and he also envisioned programs for textbooks and translation, research centers, graduate degrees, volunteer missions, regional conferences. He wrote about this in a letter to Billy Graham in 1955, before the magazine was founded. He had this vision from the get-go that the way to really have an impact on the culture would be to establish this international evangelical university that would be top-notch. Ken Concert, who was dean at Trinity and succeeded Henry as one of the editors of CT, said that education played a role in Henry's greatest failure and greatest success. He wanted this university to be modeled after 16th century Wittenberg or Geneva. He wanted it to draw the best and brightest young men. I'll put a little underline under men there. Training them in the liberal arts and sciences and sending them out to be spokesmen for the faith. But he also wanted, this dream was one that would require a huge infusion of money, which was always the problem. Christianity Today succeeded only because it was heavily endowed for its first 20 years of existence. So, and if you look at the inner workings of the magazine, Henry was not an easy person to work with. He was brilliant, but as our own George Brushover said, let's see if I can find his words, he was short and abrupt, not meaning in stature, but short and abrupt, always in a hurry. You know, he was impatient, and he was not easy to work with. Looking at the correspondence of the magazine, it was just replete with ups and downs, and his feeling taken advantage of, and all this kind of thing. So he had this vision, but as George said, Brushover said, he didn't have anyone who came alongside him with that, you know, to help bring that vision into reality. You know, this is a pretty hazy picture there, but it's Henry with Billy Graham, not in 1955, I'll say. But he did outline his vision to Graham. He wanted an environment which so articulates evangelical Christianity in relationship to the cultural crisis in all the areas of study that we shall attract students who would otherwise be inclined to go to the big established universities such as Harvard and Yale. So maybe if that university would have existed, Chris, you would have gone to Henry University.
That 18-year-old Chris.
Let us declare and demonstrate what a real education is all about. Let us reinstate an abiding concern for truth and the good, declare the awe of God as the cradle of wisdom, and reaffirm God's saving work in human life. That's kind of the way that Henry spoke and wrote, kind of in, I would say, in almost grandiose terms. And you notice a real difference if you read Karl Lundquist and you contrast it with Henry. There's a certain, kind of authoritative tone in his vision and in his work. He favored an integration model. Traditionally, colleges and universities have served as society's critical intellectual center. Within that academic framework, evangelical Christians must inject and articulate the mindset and heartbeat of revealed religion. So he wanted this school to integrate a Christian evangelical world view and life mindset, as he called it. I couldn't resist this photo of him. He just looked happier than in some of his other ones. The focus for his university would be on serious learning. There's an interesting segment where he talks about rejecting the activist dimension, which I take to mean education that keeps students awake. Anything that involved, it needed to be intellectual. He didn't want, something like service learning was totally out for someone like Henry. It needed to be kind of traditional academic learning. The world of ideas was the primary focus, and the college was the intellectually critical center of culture. He had such a profound, I felt like in some ways he just was overly impressed with the power and importance of academia, and wanting credibility was such a motivating factor in his life. We can show our continuing devotion to the veritas, truth, that Harvard and other venerable institutions have forsaken. We can make a bold stand for God's rightful priority in modern life and for truth and virtue. So that was kind of, again, his philosophy. In the establishing of Christianity Today magazine, throughout the early years, if you look at both in the content of the magazine and in the correspondence, there's constant reference to the Christian century. Christianity Today was the counterpoint to the Christian century. And in Henry's mind, his Christian university was going to be the counterpoint to Harvard. Harvard, which was established with Christian foundations, and Yale and Princeton and the University of Chicago, from which Bethel Spring. But these institutions had lost their way, and this was going to be the counterpoint. Christianity Today survived, thrived at times, morphed into something that Henry wasn't real happy with after he left. But this vision never came off the ground, and it was one that was, an abiding point of sorrow for Henry, even up until the point of his death. By the early 70s, I think that was George saying his vision of a Christian university was only a memory. It was a wonderful vision, but removed from the realities, this is George's comment, of recruitment, governance, finance, those nuts and bolts things that you've got to have to make an institution work. He proposed other models, and the Institute for Advanced Studies was one version that emerged out of that. He proposed graduate specialties at various evangelical colleges so that, like Bethel might have a graduate program in biology, but then Biola couldn't have a graduate program in that. They would have one in philosophy, or whatever the field was. But can you imagine getting all the Christian colleges to agree? Yeah, we'll have all your good students can come over here for this program, and all these will go over there. It was untenable. It wouldn't work. To his dying day, he considered the fact that there wasn't a Christian university established as a lost opportunity. Some are contending that the mantle of Henry has fallen on this unlikely candidate. This is the new president of the King's College, Greg Thornbury, called the first hipster president of the college, who does dress like that, and I think we should try to get jaded. Kind of step up his game. What do you think? He's a former dean in philosophy, professor at Union University in Tennessee. He was a Henry disciple during his college years and wrote a recent book, Recovering Classic Evangelicalism, Applying the Wisdom and Vision of Carl F.H. Henry. I listened to an interview that John Wilson did with him, which was very engaging, really interesting. And I will say this, not in print, but just for this small group here. When I interviewed George Brushover, he commented on how embarrassingly immodest Thornbury was at his inauguration event. And, he has kind of this young, edgy, in-your-face. He's a musician, and he's a mover and shaker. But he also is a philosopher and has had a strong interest in Henry for a number of years, because it was in reading Henry that it turned him from, he talks about coming to this dark point where he almost lost his faith, and his dad said, well, before you throw everything overboard, I want you to read Henry's 6-volume tome, which he did, and it changed his life. And so near the end of Henry's life, Thornbury and a couple other men from Union, I think they were mostly from Union, maybe some from Southern Baptist Seminary as well, went up to Wisconsin to see Henry and talked with him about getting a couple of his books, I think, republished. And so Thornbury did have a correspondence with Henry toward the end of his life. And he is claiming hey, we've got the new version of what Henry envisioned. Because Henry's last iteration of this Christian university was that it would be in one of the major centers of either LA or New York, or maybe Chicago. And I think New York City and New Jersey area was where they last looked at property and whatnot. And so King's College is in New York City, and it's, although it only has 500 and some students, a very small program. The last president of Dinesh D'Souza apparently secured lots of big donors for the school before he left on the arm of the wrong woman and ended up losing his position as president. Hence, the door opening for Thornberry. So who knows what might happen at the King's College. So that's just some of the little scuttlebutt in evangelicalism. We're not as dull as you may think. But the situation is different at Bethel. Those are the words of the late Carl Lundquist. Such a modest man, a dear man. I never had the pleasure of meeting him. But he, you know, when you juxtapose Henry and Lundquist next to each other, I think it would be sort of like juxtaposing Thornberry and Chris. Let's say, just say it, okay? You know, I mean, Lundquist just sounds. I mean, the first thing I read of his were some of his the reports that he would give to the board. And I was so struck by how honest and forthright he was. And it was like, you mean people actually write this and give it out? And not, you know, not like he wasn't an intellectual person, but somebody who was not driven by market forces and was willing to say things that we would largely think would be quite unpopular. Like students should be able to have long hair if they wanted to in the 70s. And it's not a big moral issue. Those are my words, not his. He was president for 28 years, founder of the Order of the Burning Heart. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. He and his wife Nancy did retreats worldwide on prayer and personal devotion. And George Brushover mentioned both Carls were traveling internationally about the same time. And yet you look at, I mean, George would be the last person who would want to disparage Carl Henry. He has incredible respect for him. But he did comment on how energized and life-giving the travel seemed to be for Carl Lundquist. And whenever you met Carl Henry, he was beaten down and discouraged. And Carl Lundquist was an optimist to the end. So, and this again is from my interview with George Brushover. He said Lundquist had huge intellectual capacity. And he said he wasn't just some dumb pietist, you know, as pietists get maligned in all sorts of ways, I'm discovering. But even though he wasn't known as the evangelical intellectual voice like Henry was, he had huge intellectual capacity. A communal and rooted vision, that was central to him. Humility and graciousness, it just comes through, it oozes through in his writing and his attitudes. He didn't aspire to be the leader of the evangelical world. He was optimistic and embracing of diversity, which I think are wonderful, you know, that's a wonderful heritage for us to have at Bethel. His passion, he wanted to see students grounded in biblical patterns of belief and practice. Yes, he wanted them to be challenged intellectually, but what good does it do to be challenged intellectually if your life is a mess? You know, if you don't have a deep faith at the core of what you're doing. He promoted the interior life, and he really helped students form a deep and passionate faith. Seminary students were required to take, was initially a 2-credit, and then it was moved down to a 1-credit class before they could graduate, sometime before they graduated, and it was a retreat. I think Lundquist and Nancy they both conducted these for years. I mean, and these were personal retreats on developing the interior life. Many people who put it off to the very end later said, if only I had done this earlier. It's like developing that devotional life that gives you, in a sense, the right to give voice intellectually. Truth plus Christ equals 1. The unifying center of the academic program is neither truth nor the pursuit of truth, but is Jesus Christ himself. Ultimately, in our Christian view, truth and Christ are one. And the important thing about truth is that it ought to point to Christ. Now, this isn't something that I think Henry would disagree with, but he would frame it differently. He would really want to, even in his points for Christian University, he put the intellectual credibility first. I mean, you know, just in the way he numbered it. I'm not saying he would theologically say that, but you wouldn't find that in Lundquist. Really, truth and the pursuit of truth is Christ, and if we point ourselves toward Christ, we will ultimately reflect the truth. We would compromise at the point of scholarship before we would at the point of Christian character. This is Lundquist talking. Ideally, however, we hope that we shall never have to make such a compromise. We want both. The impact of one life upon another is probably greater than the impact of an idea or a method of teaching. Henry, in his teaching, said he aimed at the top 1%. Some of you might not make it. Sorry. That wasn't Lundquist's approach. He was more reaching down to wherever you were. I mean, that's the sense I had, having not been able to study under him. But I love that. The impact of one life upon another is probably greater than the impact of an idea or a method of teaching. That's not, again, to disparage intellectual accomplishment, but to recognize the personal in the equation. He promoted a Christocentric liberal arts education that was built around collaborative learning, friendships between professors and students. Did you know that we have been mandated to be your friends? I have. Okay, great, thanks. No, that's not why we like you. But you know, but there isn't this real hierarchical approach. An irenic spirit is to permeate the community. These were famous words from Lundquist. Ask not, are we able to do it, but is God in it? That's the the starting point. Evangelism and education, two sides of the same coin, and no dichotomy between the sacred and the secular. During the turbulent 70s, he addressed contemporary issues such as birth control, abortion, euthanasia, and spoke very boldly to the board. And this is from one of his board letters. These are among the genuine concerns of the new generation. But these also make it a great day to be in Christian higher education. Both Christian and non-Christian youth are talking about metaphysical matters. Meanwhile, someone like Henry is having a much more negative outlook on what's going on in the world. And, you know, the 70s were turbulent, and things, you know, systems were being upended. So I'm just quickly going through this because I'm a little bit running over here. Going out on a limb, he supported student protesters on campus. Back in the Snelling campus, there were protesters, students who walked up and down the street with placards. He supported their right to do so. Clarion articles that might have been controversial, he supported the right and the importance of students to do so. He favored the lowering of the voting age. He wrote about things like this to the board. Bethel is being most true to its spiritual heritage when it encourages its students to be concerned about the social ills of the world. So that really was the, you know, kind of the founding principle, you know, or the ethos out of which he moved as an educator. Social action and individual piety were both important. In a Christian context, each is essential to the other. Bethel offers a positive Christian alternation between involvement with society and withdrawal from society. So he didn't take as negative of a view towards society. In fact, one of the quotes that, and this is that Chris, you had this on your website, and he was speaking to lifestyle regulations, you know, changes in can you dance? Well, it wasn't dancing then, it was how long your hair could be and what kind of clothes you could wear. I don't think recent changes represent any deviation in theology or disloyalty to Christ. In our school, we emphasize that we are to penetrate the structures of society for Christ and be a part of the world. The world setting itself is amoral, and many of its prevailing moods are neither good or bad. It's simply the medium in which we work. that really is different than what you would find, especially in the later Henry. And it's not that Henry didn't take courageous stance, but I think the motivation for Lundquist was different. He was optimistic to the end. For 28 years, I enjoyed the privilege of working with thousands of inspiring and committed Christian students. I concluded my tenure in 1982 more optimistic than ever about the church's future because of the spiritual qualities I saw in young people, tomorrow's leaders. I like that. I mean, I like somebody who's like happy about what they've been doing. George called him Mr. BGC. Henry wanted to address Christianity with a capital C. Lundquist was more interested in the fellowship of individual churches. He was Mr. BGC. For years, the school under Karl Lundquist defined the denomination. There was a very close relationship with the denomination, which he supported and nurtured. And one of his writings is called "The Best of the Past is a Gift to the Future," and these are just a couple sentences from that. Understanding without devotion can be cold and formal. Devotion without understanding can lead to subjectivism and heresy. Each is incomplete without the other. Pietists have taken a lot of flack for being, let's see, how do we do this here? Devotion without understanding, into the experiential, the individualism. And he would say both are necessary. So my question, Bethel University, are we living the dream? The point of Christian education, in my judgment, is that the pursuit of truth in any field leads ultimately to the Christ who is truth absolute. And when we come to him through various fields of specialization, it is to more perfectly love him with all our mind. So, I mean, we do have to think about which vision of reality do we reflect, and is it parts and pieces of both? I just want to say in conclusion that I was very interested in talking to George Brushover about by the care with which he spoke about both Lundquist and Henry. And he said, even though Carl Henry is being appropriated, as he put it, by certain very reformed schools and organizations and groups, he said that wasn't who Henry was. He was not he wasn't a strict Calvinist. He wasn't as reformed as the reformers are making him out to be. He said, I would see Lundquist, Henry, and then the reform, the Orthodox reform folks over here. He saw Henry as somewhere in between that. And I would say on that continuum, I would put George somewhere between Lundquist and Henry as somebody who came to Bethel then to kind of help beef up the academic intellectual credibility of the school, but keenly aware of the legacy of Lundquist and wanting to retain that too as a theme throughout. So there you have it. That's what I'm working on.